Welcome back. I am Pemberton, and this is part 37 of Herodotus' Histories. Now comes the famous roll call. Herodotus halts the march at Doriscus and counts the host and gives us, people by people, the whole armed world: Persians and Medes in their soft caps, Ethiopians painted in chalk and vermilion, Indians in cotton, Thracians in foxskin caps, Arabians on camels, and dozens more, each in their own gear. Then the fleet, ship by ship and nation by nation, and the captains who led them. The numbers he gives are enormous past belief. He even tells us how they measured the army, by penning 10,000 men together and counting how many pens it took to hold them all. Let us go on.
When everyone had crossed over and they had begun their march, a great omen appeared to them. Xerxes paid no attention to it, although its meaning was easy to guess. A mare gave birth to a hare. The meaning could be understood easily in this way. Xerxes was about to march against Hellas with great pride and splendor, but he would come back again to the place from which he had set out, running for his life. Another omen had also happened while he was still at Sardes. A mule gave birth to a young mule that had organs of both sexes, male and female, with the male organs above. Xerxes paid no attention to either omen, but went on his way, and the land army went with him. Meanwhile, the fleet sailed out of the Hellespont and coasted along in the opposite direction from the land army. The fleet was sailing westward toward the promontory of Sarpedon, where it had previously been ordered to go and wait for the army. The land army, however, was marching eastward toward the sunrise through the Chersonese, keeping on its right the tomb of Hel, daughter of Athamas, and on its left the city of Cardia, and passing through the middle of a town named Agora. From there it bent around the gulf called Melis, and crossed the river Melis. At that time the stream was not enough for the army and failed them. After crossing this river, from which the gulf also takes its name, the army went westward, passing by Anos, a city of the Aeolians, and by the lake Steteris, until at last it came to Doriscus. Doriscus is a broad sea beach and plain in Thrace, and the great river Hebrus flows through it. A royal fortress had been built there, the same one now called Doriscus, and a Persian garrison had been established in it by Darius ever since the time when he marched against the Scythians. Xerxes thought this place suitable for arranging his army and numbering it completely, and so he did this. At Xerxes' command, the commanders of the ships brought all their ships, when they arrived at Doriscus, up to the sea beach adjoining Doriscus. On this beach stands Sail, a city of the Samothracians, and also Zone, and its furthest point is the well-known promontory of Ceryon. In ancient times the region belonged to the Ciconians. To this beach they brought in their ships, drew them up on land, and let them dry. During this time Xerxes proceeded to count the army at Doriscus. I cannot give certain information about the number supplied by each separate nation, because no one reports this, but the total number of the land army proved to be 170 myriads. They counted them all in this way. They gathered 10,000 men together in one place, packed them together as closely as possible, and drew a circle around the outside. After drawing the circle and letting the 10,000 men leave it, they built a wall of rough stones around the circumference of the circle, up to the height of a man's navel. When this had been made, they caused others to enter the enclosed space until they had counted them all in this manner. After they had counted them, they arranged them separately by nations. Those who served were as follows. The Persians had this equipment. On their heads they wore soft felt caps called tiaras. On their bodies they wore sleeved tunics of many colors, giving the appearance of iron scales like those of a fish. On their legs they wore trousers. Instead of ordinary shields they carried wicker shields, under which quivers hung. They had short spears, large bows, reed arrows, and also daggers hanging from the belt by the right thigh. They acknowledged as their commander Autanes, father of Amstress the wife of Xerxes. In ancient times the Hellenes called these people Kephines, but they called themselves, and were called by their neighbors, Artaeans. But when Perseus, son of Dione and Zeus, came to Cepheus, son of Belos, and took his daughter Andromeda as wife, a son was born to them, and Perseus gave him the name Perses. He left the son there because Cepheus had no male child. After him, therefore, this race was named. The Medes served in the expedition equipped in exactly the same way, for this equipment is in fact Median and not Persian. The Medes acknowledged as their commander Tigranes and Achaemenid. In ancient times they were generally called Aryans, but when Media the Colchian came from Athens to these Aryans, they too changed their name. This is what the Medes themselves report about themselves. The Kishans served with equipment like that of the Persians in other respects, but instead of felt caps they wore falaise. Anaphs, son of Autanes, commanded the Kishans. The Hyrcanians were armed like the Persians, and they acknowledged as their leader Megapanos, the same man who after these events became governor of Babylon. The Assyrians served with helmets on their heads, made either of bronze or plated in a barbarian style that is not easy to describe. They had shields and spears, daggers like Egyptian knives, wooden clubs with iron knobs and linen corslets. The Hellenes call these people Syrians, but the barbarians have always called them Assyrians. Among them were the Chaldeans. Their commander was Audesps, son of Artachaeus. The Bactrians served with nearly the same head covering as the Medes, and they carried native red bows and short spears. The Scaran Scythians wore caps on their heads that rose to a point and stood upright and stiff. They wore trousers and carried native bows, daggers, and also axes of the kind called sagaris. These were called amage and sakans, being in fact Scythians, for the Persians call all Scythians sakans. The commander of the Bactrians and Sakans was Hystaspes, son of Darius and of Atassa, daughter of Cyrus. The Indians wore garments made of tree wool, and they had red bows and red arrows tipped with iron. Thus the Indians were equipped, and while serving with the rest they were assigned to Pharnazathers, son of Artabits. The Aryans were equipped with Median bows, and in other respects like the Bactrians. Sisymnes, son of Hydarnes, commanded the Aryans. The Parthians, Chorasmans, Sogdians, Gandarians, and Daticans served with the same equipment as the Bactrians. Their commanders were Artabazos, son of Pharnax, over the Parthians and Chorasmans, Ezines, son of Artaos, over the Sogdians, and Artiphios, son of Artabanos, over the Gandarians and Daticans. The Caspians served wearing coats of skin and carrying native red bows and short swords. Thus they were equipped, and they acknowledged as their leader Ariomardos, brother of Artiphios. The Sarangians were conspicuous among the rest because they wore dyed garments. They had boots reaching to the knee, Median bows, and spears. Their commander was Pharandits, son of Megabazos. The Pactians wore skin coats and carried native bows and daggers. They acknowledged as their commander Artanes, son of Ithameters. The Usians, Mycans, and Paracanians were equipped like the Pactians. Their commanders were Arsamenes, son of Darius, over the Usians and Mycans, and Syrameters, son of Oiabazos, over the Paracanians. The Arabians wore loose mantles fastened up with a girdle, and at their right side they carried very long bows that bent backward. The Ethiopians had leopard and lion skins tied on them, and bows made from a strip of palm wood, very long, not less than 4 cubits. For these bows they used small reed arrows tipped not with iron, but with a sharpened stone, the same stone with which they engraved seals. In addition they had spears, fitted with sharpened gazelle horn as a spearhead, and they also had knobbed clubs. When they went into battle, they used to smear half their bodies with white and the other half with red. The commander of the Arabians and of the Ethiopians who lived above Egypt was Arsames, son of Darius and of Artistone, daughter of Cyrus. Darius loved Artistone most of all his wives, and had an image of her made of beaten gold. Arsames, as I said, commanded the Ethiopians above Egypt and the Arabians. But the Ethiopians from the direction of the sunrise, for the Ethiopians were in 2 divisions, had been appointed to serve with the Indians. They differed in no way from the other Ethiopians except in language and in the nature of their hair. The Ethiopians from the east are straight-haired, while those of Libya have hair thicker and more woolly than that of any other men. These Ethiopians from Asia were armed for the most part like the Indians, but on their heads they wore the skin of a horse's forehead, flayed off with the ears and mane. The mane served instead of a crest, and the horse's ears were set upright and stiff. Instead of shields they used defenses made from the skins of cranes to hold in front of themselves. The Libyans went with leather equipment and used javelins burnt at the point. They acknowledged as their commander Masages, son of Arizos. The Paphlagonians served with plated helmets on their heads, small shields, spears of no great size, and also javelins and daggers. On their feet they wore native boots reaching up to the middle of the shin. The Lygians, Machinians, Mariandanoi, and Syrians served with the same equipment as the Paphlagonians. These Syrians are called Cappadocians by the Persians. The commander of the Paphlagonians and Machinians was Dodos, son of Megosidros, and the commander of the Mariandanoi, Legions, and Syrians was Gobrias, son of Darius and Artistone. The Phrygians had equipment very like that of the Paphlagonians, with only a slight difference. According to the Macedonians, the Phrygians used to be called Brygians during the time when they were natives of Europe and lived with the Macedonians, but after they moved into Asia, they changed their name along with their country and were called Phrygians. The Armenians were armed just like the Phrygians, being settlers from the Phrygians. The commander of these 2 peoples together was Artachems, who was married to a daughter of Darius. The Lydians had arms very closely resembling those of the Hellenes. In old times the Lydians were called Medonians, and they were later named after Lydos, son of Aedes, changing their former name. The Mysians wore native helmets on their heads, carried small shields, and used javelins burnt at the point. They are settlers from the Lydians, and from Mount Olympos they are called Olympianoi. The commander of the Lydians and Mysians was Artaphrons, son of Artaphrons, the man who invaded Marathon together with Datis. The Thracians served with fox skins on their heads and tunics on their bodies, with loose mantles of various colors thrown over them. On their feet and lower legs they wore boots of deerskin. Besides this they had javelins, round bucklers, and small daggers. After these people crossed over into Asia, they came to be called Bithynians, but formerly, as they themselves report, they were called Strymonians, because they lived on the river Strymon. They say they were driven out of their home by the Teucrians and Mysians. The commander of the Thracians who lived in Asia was Basax, son of Artabanos. Another group had small shields of raw ox hide, and each man carried 2 hunting spears of Lycian workmanship. On their heads they wore bronze helmets, and to the helmets were attached the ears and horns of an ox, made of bronze, Crests were also set on them. The lower part of their legs was wrapped with red, colored strips of cloth. Among these men there is an oracle of Ares. The Maeonian Cabelians, who are called Lysonians, had the same equipment as the Cilicians. What this is I shall explain when, in the course of the catalogue, I come to the array of the Cilicians. The Milians had short spears, and their garments were fastened with buckles. Some of them had Lycian bows, and on their heads they had caps made of leather. Baters, son of Histanes, commanded all these. The Moschoi had wooden caps on their heads, and shields and small spears with long points set on them. The Tibarenians, Macronians, and Masanoikoi served with equipment like that of the Moschoi. These were arrayed together under the following commanders: the Moschoi and Tibarenians under Ariomardos, son of Darius and of Parmes, daughter of Smerdes, son of Cyrus, and the Macronians and Masanoikoi under Artax, son of Cheresmus, who was governor of Sestos on the Hellespont. The mares wore native helmets of plated work on their heads, and they had small hide shields and javelins. The Colchians wore wooden helmets on their heads and had small shields of raw ox, hide, short spears, and knives. The commander of the mares and Colchians was Pharindits, son of Tispes. The Elerodians and Cisperians served armed like the Colchians, and their commander was Mecistios, son of Cyrometers. The island tribes that came with the army from the Erythraean Sea, belonging to the islands where the king settles, those called the Removed, had clothing and arms very much like those of the Medes. The commander of these islanders was Mardons, son of Bygios, who in the year after these events commanded the army of Michael and lost his life in the battle. These were the nations that served in the land campaign and had been assigned to the infantry. The men already named were the commanders of this army. They were the ones who arranged it by divisions, counted it, and appointed commanders of thousands and commanders of tens of thousands. The commanders of hundreds and of tens were appointed by the commanders of 10,000s. There were also other leaders of divisions and nations. These men, as I have said, were commanders of the army, and over them, and over the whole army that went on foot, the commanders were Mardonios, son of Gobrias, Tritontichmus, son of that Artabanos who had advised against making the march against Hellas, Smerdomenes, son of Otanes, both Tritontichmus and Smerdomenes being sons of brothers of Darius and therefore cousins of Xerxes, Macestes, son of Darius and Adasa, Jerges, son of Ariozos, and Megabyzos, son of Zapiros. These were generals of all the infantry together, except for the 10,000. The general of these 10,000 chosen Persians was Hydarnes, son of Hydarnes. These Persians were called immortals because, if any one of them left the number incomplete by dying or falling ill, another man was chosen in his place, and they were never either more or fewer than 10,000. Of all the nations, the Persians displayed the greatest splendor in their ornaments and were themselves the best men. They had the equipment already described, and besides this they stood out among the rest for the great amount of gold freely used by them. They brought carriages with them, and in these were concubines and a great number of well-equipped attendants. Supplies for them, apart from those of the soldiers, were carried by camels and beasts of burden. The nations that served as cavalry were these. Not all the nations supplied cavalry, but only those that follow. The Persians were equipped in the same way as their infantry, except that on their heads some of them wore metal work, either bronze or iron, beaten into shape. There are also certain nomads called Sagartians, Persian in race and language, whose dress is midway between that of the Persians and that of the Pactians. These supplied 8,000 horsemen. They are not accustomed to carrying any weapons of bronze or iron except daggers, but they use ropes twisted from leather thongs, and they rely on these when they go to war. Their manner of fighting is this: when they come into conflict with the enemy, they throw ropes with nooses at the ends, and whatever a man catches with the throw, whether horse or man, he draws toward himself. Those caught in the coils are then destroyed. This was their manner of fighting, and they were arrayed next to the Persians. The Medes had the same equipment as their infantry, and the Kishans likewise. The Indians were armed in the same way as those of them who served on foot, and they both rode horses and drove chariots, which were drawn by horses or wild asses. The Bactrians were equipped in the same way as those who served on foot, and the Caspians likewise. The Libyans too were equipped like those who served on foot, and all of these also drove chariots. The Caspians and Paracanians were also equipped like those who served on foot, and they all rode on camels, which were not inferior to horses in speed. These nations alone served as cavalry, and the number of the cavalry proved to be 8 myriads apart from the camels and the chariots. The rest of the cavalry was arranged in squadrons, but the Arabians were placed after them and last of all because the horses could not endure the camels. They were therefore put last so that the horses would not be frightened. The commanders of the cavalry were Harmamithras and Theos, sons of Datis. A third commander, Pharnaces, who had command of the horse with them, had been left behind at Sardis sick. As they were setting out from Sardis, an unwelcome accident happened to him. While he was riding, a dog ran up under his horse's feet. The horse, not having seen it beforehand, was frightened, reared up, and threw Pharnaces from its back. When he fell, he vomited blood, and his sickness turned into consumption. As for the horse, the servants immediately did to it what Pharnaces commanded. They led it away to the place where it had thrown its master and cut off its legs at the knees. In this way Pharnaces was removed from his command. The number of triremes proved to be 1,207, and these were the peoples who furnished them. The Phoenicians, together with the Syrians who dwell in Palestine, furnished 300. They were equipped in this way. On their heads they wore leather caps made very nearly in the Hellenic fashion. They wore linen corselets, and they had shields without rims and javelins. These Phoenicians, as they themselves report, lived in ancient times on the Erythraean Sea. From there they crossed over and now dwell in the country along the sea coast of Syria. This part of Syria, and all the region as far as Egypt, is called Palestine. The Egyptians furnished 200 ships. These men wore plated helmets on their heads, and they had hollow shields with large rims, spears for sea fighting, and large axes. Most of them wore corselets, and they had large knives. These men were equipped in this way. The Cyprians furnished 150 ships, and they themselves were equipped as follows. Their kings had their heads wound round with fillets, and the rest wore tunics, but in other respects they were like the Hellenes. Among these Cyprians there are various races. Some are from Salamis and Athens, others from Arcadia, others from Kythnos, others again from Phoenicia, and others from Ethiopia, as the Cyprians themselves report. The Cilicians furnished 100 ships. They wore native helmets on their heads, and for shields they carried targets made of raw ox hide. They wore woolen tunics, and each man had 2 javelins and a sword, the sword being made very much like the Egyptian knives. In old times these people were called Hypacheans, and they received their later name from Cilix, son of Eganior, a Phoenician. The Pamphylians furnished 30 ships, and were equipped in Hellenic arms. These Pamphylians belonged to those who were scattered from Troy together with Amphilochus and Chalcis. The Lycians furnished 50 ships. They wore corselets and greaves, and had bows of cornel wood, reed arrows without feathers, javelins, and a goat's skin hanging over their shoulders. Around their heads they wore felt caps wreathed with feathers. They also had daggers and falchions. The Lycians were formerly called Termali, being originally from Crete, and they received their later name from Lycos, son of Pandion, an Athenian. The Dorians of Asia furnished 30 ships. They had Hellenic arms and were originally from the Peloponnese. The Carians supplied 70 ships. They were equipped in other respects like Hellenes, but they also had falchions and daggers. Their former name has been told in the first part of the history. The Ionians furnished 100 ships and were equipped like Hellenes. So long as the Ionians lived in the Peloponnese, in the land now called Achaea, and before the time when Danaos and Zethos came to the Peloponnese, they were called, as the Hellenes report, Pelasgians of the coastland. Afterward they were called Ionians after Ion, son of Zethos. The islanders furnished 17 ships and were armed like Hellenes. These two were a Pelasgian race, though later they came to be called Ionian by the same rule as the Ionians of the 12 cities who came from Athens. The Aeolians supplied 60 ships. They were equipped like Hellenes, and, as the Hellenes report, used to be called Pelasgians in old times. The Hellespontians, except for those of Abydos, furnished 100 ships from the rest of those who served in the expedition from the Pontus. The men of Abydos had been appointed by the king to remain where they were and guard the bridges. The others were equipped like Hellenes. They are colonists of the Ionians and Dorians. In all the ships there served as fighting men Persians, Medes, or Saccans. Of the ships, those that sailed best were furnished by the Phoenicians, and among the Phoenicians the best were furnished by the men of Sidon. Over all these men, and also over those among them who were appointed to serve in the land army, each tribe had native chieftains. Since the course of my inquiry does not require it, I make no passing mention of them. First, the chieftains of each separate nation were not people worthy of mention, and second, within each nation there were as many chieftains as there were cities. These men too went on the expedition not as commanders, but like the others, serving as slaves. The generals who held absolute power and commanded the various nations, that is, those who were Persians, have already been mentioned by me. The commanders of the naval force were Ariobanes, son of Darius, Brixaspes, son of Aspathanes, Megabazos, son of Megabates, and Achaemenes, son of Darius. Ariobanes, who was the son of Darius and of the daughter of Gobryas, commanded the Ionian and Carian force. Achaemenes, full brother of Xerxes, commanded the Egyptians. The other two commanded the rest of the armament. Galleys of 30 oars and of 50 oars, light vessels, and long ships to carry horses had also been assembled, as it proved, to the number of 3,000. Of those who sailed in the ships, the most notable men after the commanders were these: from Sidon, Tetranestos, son of Anisos; from Tyre, Maton, son of Siromos; from Arados, Myrbelos, son of Agbelos; from Cilicia, Sienices, son of Oromdan; from Lycia, Kyberniskos, son of Sacus; from Cyprus, Gorgos, son of Chersis, and Timonax, son of Timagoras; from Caria, Hisios, son of Timnes; Pigers, son of Hisildomos, and Damasathemos, son of Candols. Of the rest of the officers I make no mention, since I am not obliged to do so, except for Artemisia. I marvel most at her for joining the expedition against Hellas, although she was a woman. After her husband died, she held the power herself, and although she had a son who was a young man, she went on the expedition, driven by high spirit and manly courage, with no necessity laid upon her. Her name, as I said, was Artemisia. She was the daughter of Lygdamus, and by descent she was of Halicarnassos on her father's side, but of Crete on her mother's. She ruled the men of Halicarnassos, Cos, Nisiros, and Calydna, and furnished 5 ships. The ships she furnished had the reputation of being the best in the whole fleet after those of the Sidonians, and of all the allies she gave the king the best counsel. As for the states of which I said she was leader, I declare their people all to be of Dorian race, the people of Halicarnassos being Troezenians, and the rest Epidaurians. So far, then, I have spoken of the naval force. When Xerxes had counted the army, and it had been arranged in divisions, he wanted to drive through it himself and inspect it. Afterward he proceeded to do so. Driving in a chariot past each nation, he asked about them, and his scribes wrote down the names, until he had gone from end to end through both the cavalry and the infantry. When he had done this, the ships were drawn down into the sea, and Xerxes, changing from his chariot to a Sidonian ship, sat down under a golden canopy and sailed along past the prows of the ships. He questioned them all just as he had done with the land army, and had the answers written down. The captains had taken their ships out to a distance of about 400 feet from the beach, and were holding them there, all with their prows turned toward the shore in an even line, and with all the fighting men armed as if for war. Xerxes inspected them by sailing inside the line, between the prows of the ships and the beach.
And there we leave the host counted millions, if you believe the figures, and Xerxes well pleased with his innumerable army. Next time, in part 38, he calls the exiled Spartan king Demaratus to his side and asks him, simply, whether the Greeks will dare to fight, and gets an answer he does not like at all, about a few free men and a master called law. Mind the footnotes, and beware the folly.